Good evening. I see Fadi's made his way in, so we can begin. Welcome to the next installment in our fall program. A couple of programming notes you will have seen on the poster and on various communications. Next Thursday, noontime in the GSD Talks space, October 10th, we have Chad Oppenheim and Eric Desbroches de Com. Oppenheim is, among other things, a Miami-based architect, and he collaborates often with Eric, who's a Parisian video game artist, among other things. And a part of what they'll be talking about is their work together on the animation of fairly compelling, at least I found them so, landscape. So landscape animation, Thursday a week, noon in Stubbins. And then next month in November, we're hosting 7,000 landscape architects with the ASLA's annual meeting in town, so be prepared for that spatially. And we will be organizing, with the leadership of Sonia Dumpelman, an exhibition that will open into this month, October 30th, and a conference, eponymous conference, Airport Landscape, Thursday evening, November 14th. Keynote lectures by Christophe Giraud, ETH Zurich, and our own Peter Gallison here from the History of Science and Technology on the topic of the airport as a landscape. And then following up on Friday, the 15th of November, a full day, 9 a.m. until 6:30 p.m. on that topic. A range of speakers beginning with Adrian Hoes giving the first keynote in the morning. Really an extraordinary set of events orchestrated by the events team and Dan Borelli and mostly Sonia. And then finally this fall, November 21st, again in Stubbins, noontime, our own Luis Quejas will be talking about his work and the reception of pamphlet architecture number 33. Please come on in. We just got started. As you know, annually, we're very pleased to host our Olmsted Lecture, most often in the fall, as it happens. And the Olmsted Lecture has been, over the recent past, and for some time now, a moment to reflect and to engage with leaders in the ideas of landscape architecture, among other things, history, theory, conception. And so it's in that space I'm very pleased to introduce Rod Barnett. Rod joins us from Auburn University, where he is professor and chair of landscape architecture, among other roles that he plays. He is, to my mind, among the most consistently original and stimulating thinkers in the field. He landed in Auburn 4 years ago. Rod and I are slight contemporaries in the sense that we shifted countries about 4 years ago to take up leadership roles, and so we occasionally compare notes and commiserate. And to the extent that both of our little projects are beginning to be evident, for better and for worse, we thought it might be a nice moment to reconnect. Among other things, Rod has been a prolific author on a range of topics, in particular with respect to theories in landscape architecture as they relate to social and maybe also political critique. His more recent work is focusing more specifically on the social. I've asked him to this evening focus on his most recent publication, which is in some ways maybe for him looking back a little bit, but I hope that's okay. Because we're still just receiving the book itself, dealing with Emergence. Please welcome Rod Barnett, Nonlinear Encounters, Emergence in Landscape Architecture.
Well, hello everybody, and thanks so much, Charles, for the introduction and for inviting me here. I do appreciate it. It's very generous, and I'm looking forward to an engagement. We'll see what happens. Emergence is what I'm going to talk about. It's a huge topic, and it's one of those topics that it's very difficult to talk about anything without talking about all of it. However, I've chosen tonight to focus on three little, in fact, might even be minute aspects of this vast topic in order to perhaps pursue some of those rabbits that tend to disappear down the rabbit holes when we're talking about ideas and affect and emotion in the landscape. These things are often discussed, I think, in a way which doesn't really engage with the sort of significance of those ideas. And so that's what I'm trying to sort of bring to surface tonight through this encounter with encounters. So if I may take my jacket off. glasses out. Thanks. So I start by suggesting that nonlinear encounters occur in nonlinear landscapes. Any landscape is nonlinear. It will consist of a set of conditions which attract different components of the landscape system: birds, lovers, shadows, rats, along different trajectories into different states. By means of the interactions thus enabled, different structures emerge. Progressive differentiation occurs. I am interested in how these differential processes first can be theorized and then used by landscape architects in their ongoing construction of the world. A nonlinear landscape is an open system. It is a terrain that is in continual interaction with its environment. The more open it is, the more sensitive it is to external influence. When we talk about such systems, we're not talking about conditions that are somehow external to human life. We must recognize, as many ecologists do, that humans are in the system. In fact, there is no world assemblage in which humans are not a part. As I'm sure you're aware, open systems are driven by feedback. Information that is generated within the organization influences the generation of further information. If humans are in the system, then language is too. And so are the ideas and concepts that we formulate in language. At just this point, where we say ideas and concepts are in the system, we have a feedback loop. The otherwise undifferentiated phenomena we call the world are subject to our classifications, just as calling something a system, and then this classification influences how we think about the world. So language frames systems, identifies their terms, their boundary conditions, their components, and regulates their interactions. In turn, these identifications help us evolve our concepts. As language concepts change, our understanding of the system changes. And we're constantly reclassifying. When we reclassify, systems, organizations transform. An example is the change of status of Kudzu vine. Imported from Japan, Kudzu now blankets more than 7 million acres of US territory and costs up to $50 million annually to control. Scientists at the Earth Institute and Columbia University have discovered that Kudzu may even be contributing to climate change, having found that the vine is causing ozone formation in low levels of the atmosphere. A member of the pea family, Kudzu was imported first in order to stabilize erosion in the south and to provide fodder for stock. It was planted extensively in the 1930s on the orders of the Soil Erosion Service. According to a study at a Georgia research station, the plant could stop 80% more water and 99% more soil from running off than cotton could. Within a decade, the amount of kudzu in cultivation went from 10,000 to 50,000 acres. In 1943, an entrepreneurial farmer, Channing Cope, inaugurated the Kudzu Club of America and wrote a book on how to plant and grow it. But kudzu has no natural predators in the US, and in 1970 the Department of Agriculture officially declared it a weed. It is now in 32 states, and a herbicide has still not been found that can kill it without leaching into surface water used for irrigation. In what is now called the fight against kudzu, interaction between social and organic agents demonstrates the discursive element in assemblage construction. A powerful semiotic component in the evolution of new landscapes can, as the story of kudzu shows, develop dramatically in favor of the organic replicator when cultural and social institutions, such as market capitalism, reinforce growth through cultural adaptation, for instance, trying to farm prairie, that has maladaptive consequences. We see with the arrival of kudzu a classic example of an open system being subject to disturbance and biological and social conditions adjusting accordingly. Social scientists and physical scientists have demonstrated over many different cases not only that systems interact with other systems, but that they require interaction in order to thrive. Assemblages enter into composition with other assemblages. This characteristic enables them to change and evolve without the imposition of form from outside. System change is endogenously generated, i.e. internally generated. This we call morphogenesis. Morphogenesis enables systems to become different from what they were. The human beings who encounter this unfolding difference in the world are also continually differing themselves. We have, therefore, a becoming different of many diverse conditions, so that each encounter between these conditions is a novel encounter, unscripted, unpredicted, and always open to further novelty. Since different systems are interacting with each other and becoming different from what they are all the time, and since it is not knowable how these interactions will turn out, it follows that future states of systems are unknowable. The future states of open systems, such as cities, ecosystems, rivers, communities, individuals, and so on, are all unpredictable. Therefore, we live with ambivalence and uncertainty. Further, if everything is becoming different according to its own powers of interaction through its encounters with other multiplicities, and these are all becoming different too, then heterogeneity is a condition of our existence as well. If these are the hallmarks of an open world, and if open systems are the subject matter of landscape architecture, then these are the challenges we face. They're also the opportunities we embrace. The world consists of humans and non-humans in interaction with each other as much as it consists of humans and non-humans and non-humans. All bodies encountering bodies and entering into compositions that are either productive or unproductive, agreeable or disagreeable, empowering or disempowering. Landscape architecture is the art of organizing these encounters in such a way as to increase humans and non-humans' self and other empowerment. That is, to enable them the dignity and assurance of their right to self-determination, be they fish, plant, bird, or beast. Landscape architecture puts species into the conditions that they require in order to become what they are. Just as gardening is the production of difference through the husbandry of natural processes, landscape architecture is the production of difference through the organizing of social and environmental conditions. In the remainder of this talk, I'm going to explore the various propositions I've just discussed through three little investigations that seek to demonstrate the potential role of emergence in landscape architecture. The first is an interpretation of an art historical set of concepts that cluster around the idea of the medieval garden of love. The second is an exploration of landscape in cinema. And third is a thought experiment, a visual thought experiment based on an investigation of human, non-human encounter in public space, working with the urban coyote population in the small university town where I live, Auburn, Alabama. So this section of the talk advances an argument to the effect that, contrary to many discussions, the medieval trope of the garden of love does not depict a metaphor for renunciation of earthly delights in order to enter the kingdom of heaven. Instead, I say, it celebrates emergence and difference and accepts the challenge they present. Difference exists not to be overcome, but to be understood. The tension between spiritual and sensual passion is imaginatively examined by artists who represent the garden of love, not condemn it. To medieval artists, garden topoi, such as the locus amoenus, the hortus conclusus, and the earthly paradise, were available from a complex genealogy of garden depiction. Theocritus, Virgil, and Ovid provided a link between music, leisure, and landscape. The idea of the locus amoenus, or pleasant spot, derived from a poetry that situated human beings within a landscape of sunlight and shade, gentle breezes, and effortless abundance. The ancient figure draws also on the actual experience of the world by the people who lived in it and interacted with it. The Garden of Eden, with its horticultural and hydrological themes, was also an important tradition. My suggestion is that the Garden of Love calls attention to the condition of emergence or becoming as a specific and distinctive characteristic of medieval landscape discourse. The idea of becoming, of a nature that is fluid, dynamic, open-ended, has always contrasted with the unitary conception of the world as a static, ordered expression of being that Parmenides characterized as the only real. By emergence, I refer to conditions and processes and behaviors that change as a result of their continual encounter with other states and processes. Crucial to this formulation is the idea of becoming as a continual gifting of life to the world. A geographical trope that exists only in works of art and craft, the Garden of Love begins to appear in visual arts practices around the 9th century and reaches the height of its popularity in the Quattrocento. By this time, it's featuring in manuscript illustration, painting, sculpture, in bas-relief on marriage chests, and in small personal items, such as combs and mirrors. The earliest known illustration of a Garden of Love is a small painting by an unknown Florentine artist of the late 14th century. It shows several young men and women gathered around a marble fountain. Music is played, 3 lovers dance, and a tree rises from a meadow scattered with bright flowers. The garden is enclosed, a world apart. It is an idyllic place where perfect harmony reigns between all creatures. The Garden of Love also occurs throughout troubadour poetry, Provençal poetry, as a beautiful setting for the seizure by or loss of love. Love, as this poem sings, is everything. Love's relationship to gardens points to the affective potential of garden making and to that special sensitivity to its entanglement with things that landscape invites from human subjectivity. The flowering plants of many European species, such as roses, lilies, and daisies, on the one hand, or species of Eastern origin, such as ginger, cinnamon, and turmeric, on the other, lend themselves to a wide range of semantic deployment, providing regional as well as aesthetic frames, while the lawns are sometimes cropped, sometimes waving in the breezes that always seem to drift through the gardens. The enclosing element is often a high brick or stone wall, sometimes a wicker fence or a wooden trellis. Almost always, there is a fountain in the center of the garden, usually octagonal, always flowing. The Garden of Love, then, is an opulent, rarefied world, separated from its surrounding territories. Its various components, music, dance, horticultural abundance, are marks of difference from the outside world. Upon entering the garden, the individual is transfigured because transgression is permitted. People are often half naked. They fondle and kiss. Time, law, and death lie outside the wall, while the garden enjoys a fertile, eternal spring, vouchsafed by the operations of difference. The idea that for medieval people, spiritual redemption represented liberation from worldly existence, that to be deserving of paradise one had to forswear all pleasures, begs an interesting question. How does the Jardin d'Amour, the Garden of Love, with its seeming glorification of earthly love, feature in such a culture of renunciation? It is worth asking another question. To what extent was the promissory condition of saintliness actually aspired to or believed in by the people who in the Middle Ages made gardens and enjoyed them, or by the writers and artists who explored their imaginative possibilities? In the 13th century, Albertus Magnus described such places as gardens of no great utility or fruitfulness, but designed for pleasure. And there is ample proof that ornamental gardening flourished in England and Europe from the 11th century. It would seem, as Umberto Eco has argued, that the view that the Middle Ages rejected the sensual world shows a basic misunderstanding of the period. It is certainly not as easy as a simple distinction between the sacred and the profane. Surely it's the very point of these illustrations to show how the separation of world, life, and love into sacred and profane is a misprision, that the rift between understanding and sensation, Adam and Eve, is an illusion, that the message of the Jardin d'Amour is that paradise is to be found on earth. The ambivalence can be traced to Plato, whose dichotomy between sacred love and profane love affects all later metaphysics. It is just this antinomial character of love that the idea of the medieval garden explores through Chaucer's poems, in Dante and Boccaccio, and in the Roman de la Rose. Since Aristotle, there were two metaphysical zones: the celestial realm beyond the sphere of the moon, which was eternal and perfect, and the sublunar human world, which was subject to change and corruption. This world of opposites, of differentiation and emergence, is the domain of human knowledge. Humans must pick their way through it, however they can. The world is not our homeland, says the narrator of the Old English poem, The Seafarer, but our place of exile. Christian theology had determined that this realm of multiplicity and difference must be renounced. But for the Greeks, the division between the perfect spiritual world and the imperfect physical world was understood in terms of connection, not renunciation. In Plato's Symposium, Diotimus says, "Love is the mean between the immortal and the mortal. He is a great spirit who interprets between gods and men, that it is through love that all the intercourse and converse of God with man is carried on." And Plotinus cast the whole of God's creation as an emanation of love, summarized in the scholastic maxim that good diffuses itself. The result was that the imaginary garden of love, that of the Roman de la Rose, as much as of the painted chambers of the Palazzo Davanzati, shown here, or the Florentine Jardin d'Amour, the sublimer realm of bodies, trees, flowers, carnality, and desire, is itself an actualization of divine love, of a continual benediction of emergence, conceived as erotica and amoenita. The trope of the garden of love, it would seem, is one from which all finality has been excluded. The endless springtime, the overflowing fountain, the thousand-flower meadow with its starry carpet are all transmuted into a vision of heavenly infinitude. The logic of Neoplatonism demands that the process of generation continue. The essence of God's love is an immeasurable and inexhaustible energy. Ovid's Metamorphoses had implied that the very nature of reality is to be grasped only during the process of transformation. Likewise, awash in multiplicity, Armand, the lover in the Roman de la Rose, that's the Roman de la Rose, novel of the Rose, discovers his sacred goal in the continual becoming of the world. It is just because they're immersed in life that the unfolding of beings achieves intelligibility. Humans are active intellectually in the creation of the world. Creation, says Aquinas, is in the creature and is the creature. Difference itself is immanent. Within the fabric of generic elements of fountain, tree, bird, and wall, the lovers are always fully fleshed out individuals with recognizable features and very human marks of difference. They are real people. This image shows nature standing at the gate to a garden with the key. Juno, Venus, and Minerva, the goddesses associated with discord and the subjects of the judgment of Paris, are all depicted in the enclosed garden. Rather than being mutually exclusive, the lover must choose one, the suggestion is that love is both carnal and holy. Far from being contradictory, eros and moral perfection live together in a subtle process of amalgamation. The tension between spiritual and sensual passion is imaginatively examined by artists, not condemned. The theme of the Garden of Love in the Tuscan art of the early Renaissance could not have appeared, as it does, in a wide range of works commissioned for marriages, if it depicted a life or culture of profanity. Some readings of the Roman de la Rose interpret its story as concluding that the Garden of Love is dangerous and irrational, leading humans away from the divine. However, it's possible to find in Armand's journey through the Garden of the Rose a different significance. The idea of the garden as a landscape of love as a site for the exploration of human temptation and therefore an exploration of the human condition of passion versus reason, inaugurated in the story of the Garden of Eden and eroticized in the Song of Solomon, is, in the rose garden shown here, brought to its fullest expression. The many mutable things found in the garden, where flowers wither and animals and birds live their brief lives, and pain is accompanied by sorrow, are all part of a visible world in which ambivalence and double coding are always present. The Ovidian tradition accepts this world as the site of real redemption through love, where multiplicity is not itself evil. Here, flesh and spirit, beauty and danger apply to different things in different respects that are not characterized by a progressive teleology, but by a continual interanimation. The rose garden is thus the site of the fulfillment of human becoming by means of an engagement through God's love in the very things of the world that are animated by that love. The garden of the spirit is thus achieved in this life, in this world, through the natural functioning of very human faculties. When Amant looks into the fountain in Diduit's garden, the mirror image of love is disturbed by surface ripples that suggest its multiple refracted nature. What the lover finds at the center of the garden of desire, then, is not an impossible beloved object, but the ambivalent subject himself, in whom the object of desire is present, not identical with him, internal, but different. The ambivalent and transgressive garden of love is defined by authority and equivocation, carnality and moral perfection, desire and renunciation, the opposites moving together in a subtle dance. This is a terrain where the operations of emergence can be played out through the active role of cognition, vision, and passion in the acceptance of the paradoxical nature of love itself. The lovers for whom the garden lives are holy sinners, joyful consumers of the delights of human desire, who accept and rejoice in the antinomial condition of becoming human in the shadow of God. In gardens, then, humans discover that they are a part of nature and at the same time separate from it, and that they're always, therefore, in conjunctionis oppositorum. Conjunctionis oppositorum refers to the dance of opposites within a compositional condition that both enables the dance and is transformed by it. And so now, continuing our exploration of landscape encounter, we turn to film and the cinematic genre known as film noir, which offers a huge range of human landscape compositional practices. These are scenes from the finale of Kiss Me Deadly, made by Robert Aldrich in 1954. The lighting of film noir is an important aspect of its representation of people, landscape, affect. The merging of agonal movement and image in noir forges an identity of matter and light and perfectly captures the immanence of subject and object, the immersion of subject in object that characterizes dance. It was French cinema critics who first identified and theorized noir film as a specifically American contribution to cinema, and then began exploring it themselves. Last Year in Marienbad is a French film made in 1963, directed by Alain Resnais with a screenplay by Alain Robbe-Grillet. It featured Delphine Seyrig as a mysterious woman, A, and Giorgio Albertazzi as an equally mysterious man, X. In this film, the lighting techniques discovered in noir are put to use in a way which really emphasizes the continuity between humans and the landscapes they seek out. The film is set in a number of gardens of Bavarian chateaux, all constructed together in the film to make it feel and look like one. These gardens were made between 1684 and 1705 by the Bavarian elector, or prince, Max Emanuel, at the time that Watteau was painting his Fête Galante, paintings of people in gardens. Axial and geometrical, these gardens include long vistas and small intimate spaces for play, conversation, and entertainment. Garden historian Helmut Reinhardt describes Emmanuel's gardens as having a deliberately planned disorder, where various parts develop a strong individuality and sometimes seem to split off into autonomous areas. It's no wonder, then, that René and Rob Grier set their cinematic investigation of the relationship between feelings, affections, and memory in these spaces, where human subjectivities are interpreted, like the gardens themselves, as asymmetrical layouts in which deliberately planned disorder reigns. Like the gardens, the thinking, feeling human cannot be seen as a whole and no longer contains a single viewpoint from which an overall sense of the field of forces in which they're enmeshed can be taken in. Last year at Marienbad presents a situation. The unnamed woman, A, and the man, X, meet at the chateau that has been converted into a hotel. The man tries to convince the woman that they've met before under similar circumstances in Marienbad. But A does not want to remember. X is very precise about the earlier assignation, but the woman prevaricates. Eventually, however, she does begin to remember. Something momentous happened, a declaration of love, a seduction, or a rape, a murder even. Finally, at midnight, the couple leaves the hotel, but only to get, as the script puts it, lost forever in its garden. The film depicts the man's insistence and the woman's hesitation as they converse in different parts of the garden. For the viewer, there's no way to decide who's telling the truth. It asks, can we ever know, between two persons, which is the way to the truth? Or are we always lost forever in unknowing? The vast pleasure garden that the protagonists alternatively view from the terrace and wander through as they speak is not a mere backdrop to human frustration and bedevilment, nor is it an objective correlative, a visual or physical formula that expresses a particular mental state. Instead, the garden features in the film as a necessary part of its cinematic condition. The trees are black against white paths and skies, and the characters are often dressed in black and white evening wear. This configuration of chromatics, geometry, and affect emphasizes the shifting frames of reference in which the couple is caught. The now, the then, the quotidian, the extraordinary, the spoken, the unspoken, the banal, the horrific. It seems as if none of these layers of experience can be separated. The film explores their movement beyond the categories of subject and object, inside and outside. We're enmeshed in an open and undecidable economy of affect and disorder, even as we construct a fragile social framework to give the appearance of order and control. The garden dramatizes a dilemma. The couple depends on the social order, but they're acting in ways that show their own doubt of its stability. The logic of the Baroque garden is nothing without the people who inhabit it. It is an amalgam of opposing principles. The philosopher Baruch Spinoza, who lived just before Emmanuel built his gardens, had said that a body is defined by the possible relations into which it may enter, and in fact develops desires for relations. Affect, he said, is a product of this desire. Spinoza spoke of the art of organizing encounters as an effort of uniting and combining empowering relations. The relations that X and A enter into with each other are composed within the multiple relations that crisscross the spectacle space of the garden. What unfolds in Last Year in Marienbad is a vital process of differentiation that occurs between the woman and the man, a movement that links an indefinite temporality, last year, with a half-remembered spatiality in Marienbad, in a rigorously structured cinematic present. Spinoza's theory of pleasure as an art of organizing relations is important for landscape architecture, finally. Gardens are places where human beings may discover and experience what human life can be. Removed from the world and yet open to it, gardens permit us to realize the effective nature of life through an immersion in it. Landscape architects, themselves organizers of relations, affirm the productive dynamic of the world and place humans within this dynamic as participants in the constitution of its life. If life, therefore, is constantly being constructed, then in pleasure gardens we find a process of world composition that dissolves the differences between thinking, feeling, and living. We can see from this famous shot that last year in Marienbad, and films like it, show us that landscape architecture seems to be missing some interesting aspects of its mission. That landscapes are places where human beings may discover and experience what human life can be is one of its fundamental insights. So, what happens then when we consider the inhabitants of the earth as a collective of species that are not considered epistemologically or ontologically distinct? For this small design experiment, the notion of a separate human nature is abandoned and replaced with Bruno Latour's idea of nature cultures, an assemblage of humans and non-humans. Boundaries are significant in the establishment of cultural formations about what belongs to a place and what does not belong, what is natural to a region and what is not, what is foreign and what is not. This section explores, quite modestly, the provocation of traditional values in the reconfiguration of boundaries between what is acceptable and what is unacceptable in Auburn, Alabama. It foregrounds the webs of cohabitation and encounter that landscapes comprise, permit, and sustain, and develops an account of environmental potential that emphasizes the effective nature of human relations with the non-human in the context of a constructed landscape. The city of Auburn, like many others, has its fair share of issues to do with indigeneity, naturalness, and exoticism. As always, the negotiation of these issues leads quickly into the more obviously value-laden concepts of place, identity, purity, and contamination. Public space is the primary site of this negotiation, as the public realm offers an extraordinary venue for what Latour calls the unmitigated assembly of beings. Auburn is in Lee County. Researchers in the Forest and Wildlife Department of Auburn University have been studying the urban coyote population for many years, and we've joined up with them for this experiment. So this is a project that intentionally puts urban coyotes into public space, urban public space. Coyotes are smaller than wolves, about the size of dogs. They tend to travel in pairs, having a litter every year, one of two of whom survive. Their habitat structure requires cover of woodland trees and shrubs, and rivers and streams, which they move along, and continual access to food. Humans and coyotes have a long record of interaction, and now that they've become urbanized, coyotes inhabit the same place as we do. When seen in Auburn, as they often are, the city's Wildlife Services Office is called in to trap and poison them. The wildlife officers themselves say that coyotes are impossible to eradicate. One told me, "They will always be here. Auburn is a green space city. Coyotes love it." Historically, the coyote's range was confined to the arid regions of the Midwest, extending north to Alberta and south to Mexico. But from 1900 to 1939, the coyote began to extend its range eastward and moved north too into Alaska as wolves were killed off by settlers. Coyotes didn't penetrate into the eastern states until the 1940s, moving into Ontario first, then down into New York, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts, and then back up into Nova Scotia in the 70s. Like all nomadic species, whose provenance is uncertain, coyotes are subject to cultural narratives or myths that guide and direct the perceptions of settler mentalities. So here we have Auburn. Coyotes often travel along or across the roads. Waterways are essential to their movement. Populations occur on the fringes of the city in association with these waterways. But while water is always present, it's not the only factor in coyote distribution. Commercial areas provide a lot of anthropogenic sources of food, that is, food associated with humans. Built structure therefore influences population distribution, and a number of coyote territories occur adjacent to built-up areas. Some populations develop interesting relationships with other nomadic and informal communities. And of course, all these conditions coincide with Auburn's highly wooded landscape, interspersed with grasslands, crops, and pasture. Spatially, coyote populations are very dynamic, as their territories change through time according to competition for food and changing physical conditions. However, the mapping of the Auburn population reveals a generational stability within which much local movement occurs. Coyotes are both migrants and nomads. In the short term, as nomads, packs and individuals will go from point to point. In the long term, as migrants, they fling off individuals who move to new habitat structures to create new possibilities. Generally speaking, these animals move through the city of Auburn eating and drinking in a kind of parallel landscape whose spaces are open and negotiable, continually being reconstructed, unconditioned by human borders and enclosures. Coyotes are known to be extraordinarily opportunistic, and this is what has enabled them to survive and thrive in urban situations. The Auburn packs are getting bigger, dispersing greater numbers of juveniles into the urban woodlands all the time. As a result, there are many sites of optimal encounter between humans and coyotes in Auburn. 5 potential intervention locations were identified. They were distributed along the corridors that are used by packs and pairs and individual animals to move from place to place. Designs were developed for 3 sites. Each site had different qualities, but they all conformed to the requirement that they were public space or public-private space that could be accessed by people during the normal course of their activities. I'll explain one example, which is as yet unfinished. Here we see the location of the city-owned Bailey Alexander Water and Sewer Services Complex. It is on the city's ring road and adjacent to a woodland that stretches around the road. The site is like a probe head for coyote movement, extending their territories into new space. The corridor brings coyotes right next to the university campus. The Bailey Alexander complex's main feature is an undeveloped retention pond located between the factory buildings and parking lots and the woodland corridor. The pond is fed by a stream in the woodland and discharges into a subterranean stormwater system. The question this design research, if that's what I could call it momentarily, is what will happen when the urban coyote assemblage merges with the human system with which it overlaps in a condition designed to permit this encounter. Following Latour's blending of nature and culture, the approach here is to intersect the habitat systems of many different species in order to create the initial conditions for a new assemblage that can begin to evolve through continued disturbance and feedback. This, then, is a project about food, about predation, replication, and interspecific encounter. Gut and scat examinations have shown that Auburn coyote's main diet consists of rodents, rabbits, and native fruits, with the occasional adventitious road-killed deer. They eat a lot of native and exotic fruits and nuts that have fallen to the ground, as well as insects like crickets and grasshoppers. Therefore, it's important to analyse the fruiting season of the species which will be used to provide the initial conditions. Remember, the idea is to attract as many species as possible by providing prey, fodder, and shelter, a complex habitat structure that enables populations to interact. The rhythm of food production through the seasons is critical if the terrain is to support and enhance the evolution of longitudinal intersystem encounters. Plant species support the development of avian systems and provide habitat for insects, lizards, and small animals. Tree species are planted to give buds, flowers, and fruits from January to December. An important consideration in the development of public space as the primary site of human-non-human encounter is its operation as an assemblage sensitive to changing conditions. As has been well observed by others, if everything is seen to change, human communities are quickly alienated. Since that's not our intention, the Bailey-Alexander site is snapped into a set of interlocking geometrical forms that can be read by human visitors as a designed realm with purpose and amenity. Coyotes are determined, swift vectors whose trajectory has taken them across a species boundary into a condition of continuous encounter with humans. It is this border crossing that we wish to highlight by showing the extreme porosity of edges that are perceived to be rigid. The main feature of the design experiment is the planting of fruit trees to offer sequential fodder for non-human species and humans alike. The folks who work at the Bailey-Alexander complex will find what is essentially an orchard at their doorstep. And coyotes who travel the woodland corridor will find a ready source of prey, as well as vegetative food. The establishment of grasses occurs first, and then the fruit trees are planted. By this time, small animals and insect species have rediscovered the area and begun to forage there. Eventually, coyotes will enter the scene, drifting in from the woodland corridor that skirts the site. When all the systems are in interaction, humans and coyotes will come together in a constructed terrain in which the assemblage of beings is made visible and vocal. It is a place where this collective is articulated. To do this, to work inside the notion of nature cultures, the landscape architect needs to be tuned to the habitus of all the parties that make up the collective. The designer of collective terrains successfully articulates the assembly of species that inhabit them when she mixes these parties while retaining and enhancing their freedoms, enabling the formation of intricate attachments and affordances between and among species and elements through affective contact and interanimation. It is not clear what will happen, but isn't that part of the point? To enable mimetic and genetic replications to occur spontaneously and forge passages between concepts and species in such a way as to investigate just how human beings live in the world and how they intersect with other non-human species. And affect is the capacity to increase our own and others' ability to become who they are through an active engagement in the world. And so, to summarize, I've discussed some aspects of emergence in landscape architecture, using 3 interpretive examples of what I've called for this talk, nonlinear encounters. Through the examples of medieval gardens and cinema and border control, I've foregrounded ideas that I believe are useful for landscape architecture. Ideas of disturbance and transgression, difference, uncertainty, and heterogeneity. How these ideas shape our encounters in the landscapes we make. Adapting Spinoza, I've called landscape architecture an art of arranging encounters. The endeavour is primarily to draw attention to the potential for landscape architecture to reshape our common world so that all creatures, human and non-human, can articulate their capacity to become different. Waxing a little romantic here. After all, becoming different is simply self-determination, and self-determination is guaranteed us by the Republic of Beings. The project of landscape architecture is to create this republic. Thank you. Okay. I'll just take any questions if anyone has any.
Hi, I want to thank you very much for the talk. I was wondering about this dance that can be kind of arranged through landscape architecture, and how does it figure to kind of agricultural, quote-unquote agricultural landscapes? And I have to assume that a lot of what you're talking about tonight is actually like a pretty strong critique of at least like our factory, kind of factory farm, or even factory material production. Can Can you speak to that?
Factory material production of
Objects rather than of subjects that can be self-determined.
yeah, well, I guess it is a critique. Yeah, that's the deal. And I think I have confused what I think about subjects and objects a little bit in this talk. The idea isn't to really configure the landscape in such a way that subjects are somehow the condition, but that subject and object should just disappear. And there is a shared condition in which the notion of subject and object is no longer important. And so I think in terms of like the factory, and the factory is a kind of element that occurs in a kind of consumption economy, then clearly factories are there to make objects for subjects to consume. So in that sense, my landscape architecture is a factory of conditions, then I would say it is a critique of that aspect of landscape architecture, which puts people into places as subjects that consume the objects that landscape architecture has placed there. Ed. I really don't know. This is an Auburn, Alabama question.
Yes. Prominently on the names of roadways.
Yeah, okay. Shug Jordan was a coach of the football team. So in order to get your name on a roadway, that's the best way. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's pronounced Shug, actually. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. But so I don't want to be long-winded about this, but your points about that's a foregone conclusion, right? Everyone, settle in. No, the points about the inevitable creation of difference are quite beautiful, and what I'm interested in is the reproduction of the same somehow. And I'll give you two examples of this, one familiar, one unfamiliar. The familiar one is when you showed Auburn for the first time, what struck my eye was the number of baseball fields. And you think here's which were originally called Elysian Fields, by the way. So you have this baseball field, you imagine something terrific's gonna happen. But if you look at baseball, it's a game of statistics. It reverts to a norm. And the game always plays out more or less the same, which is why it's so rewarding in a sense, in spite of these kind of wonderful plays that happen on the field. And I guess if that were the familiar context for me, the other is, you know, all the images you began with in your talk, they speak to me of a certain tradition, where, you know, that they endure itself is a miracle of survival, that they remain present to us, whether it's the hortus conclusus or what have you, that we perpetuate the same somehow, admittedly with different interpretations. And that's endemic to discussions of emergence or you know, open systems as you describe them. And this is what I want to get too esoteric, but the last thing I'd say is what struck me is your introduction to the notion of eros is, you know, that beautiful passage when Kangyam is talking about the creation of the same from the same. You know, how is it that life creates order from life when all other things become disorderly? And he speaks of it in terms of eros and thanatos, and he says the reason for that is that the irresistible will is to assimilate with all that is around us, that our perpetuation of orderliness, of self-sameness that we dower our children with, is a great feat of resistance and struggle in a way. And better, wouldn't it be better in some way to assimilate? So the great feat of differentiation in a field of same, you know, the neg entropy you spoke of, is something I just want to keep in the conversation.
So the person, landscape, or garden, or whatever the condition system that encounters some kind of alterity, something else, something other, then it's the nature of that encounter is critical. And does it assimilate? Does it eject? Does it transform the thing that's being encountered? What is the nature of the intertransformation that occurs? I think that's what we're interested in as landscape architects, or at least could be interested, is I think the problem of assimilation is that it might be beautiful in certain contexts, but in other contexts it's dire in the sense that it comes into the condition and either it sits there, like say certain kinds of trees in a field, and its relationship with the field is such that the field itself doesn't really gain a lot, I guess is what I'm saying. And part of what I'm trying to think through is how landscape architecture enables the trees in the field to develop a new condition that hasn't been presaged by the previous versions of either of those. And that's why I'm interested in open systems, because at least according to the literature, the theory, the science, the experience, that's how novelty is created. And I guess if we're interested in novelty, and there's always a big issue around that, pure novelty hasn't been, I mean, if we knew what it was going to be, it wouldn't be novel. So that's the problem for landscape architects, I think, is the creation of novelty in a condition in which that the unexpected is not really tolerated. So,
Thanks very much. As part of it's a really fascinating talk and topic that you've investigated throughout these different historical periods that, in addition to the transcendental nature of emergence itself, also the garden itself figures very obviously as part of this stage, space, environment, platform where this plays itself out. And I think you aptly said that landscape architecture provides this possibility of simultaneous enclosure and flow, which, for example, architecture is not able to do, right? To a certain extent. I mean, there's a polemic that's underlying the talk, and I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about how, from another perspective, let's say the B-side to this conversation has a lot to do with a reclamation of the garden as urban subject, whereas one could speak easily about, in relationship to beings, we could have easily almost expected wildlife bridges to factor in as part of the subject, but then you still return to this almost like cosmopolitan subject, mythological subject, and ecological subject that starts to rethink whether or not it's a Victorian old world notion of the garden, and all of a sudden you make it, a contemporary or cosmopolitan subject. And can you speak a little bit more about that, because it's somewhat nicely unexpected as part of your talk, but also there's a very important critique, I think, to the current discussion about urban spaces.
wow, yeah. Problem with garden as idea, I think, is that it's been subject to a lot of definitions, and things that I mentioned, like enclosure and boundary and difference and inside and outside, are all problematic with respect to garden. If we were to really take garden as something like presented in this talk as that enclosed and bounded kind of area, which we put that aside. I mean, I'm trying to show that despite its enclosure, it is, as I said, awash in multiplicity. But if we continue to consider the garden as a realm apart, then it's very difficult to understand how the aspects of the garden that are so fruitful for landscape architecture can be introduced into an unbounded field, and problematic for, say, urban design or urban landscape architecture is, I think we really need to look at that and ask ourselves whether, say, connecting ecological systems with the view to developing the kind of thing I'm talking about, which is an affective encounter. What I'm trying to say is that just by connecting ecologies, we're not doing that we need to look back to the garden to find out what it was that was so specific and interesting about it, bring it forward without those definitional problems, and ask whether it's still possible. And I'm saying it is, but it's dangerous.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for the wonderful talk and incredible examples, especially the coyote and human encounter. And I was interested in your notion of referring to Spinoza about the art of arranging encounters. And in the coyote example, it's an encounter between what you could call an animal and a human. Do you consider that approach that you took in that project to be applicable in projects where you're considering encounters between communities of humans?
Communities
Of
between humans and humans.
Between human.
Well, yeah,
Or-
I mean, that's just a
or
kind of
does it-
metaphorical example of what we're really talking about.
But does it put too much pressure on the landscape architect or designer to determine who the parties are who are encountering each other to design for a community?
Well, that's a big question, and I think it's a great question, and so I guess you guys are struggling with that. Here is the degree to which we make decisions about the systems that we're working with, the populations we're working with. We're already framing them. That's part of my thing about this talk, is that in order to discuss anything, I have to frame it, and then I have to reveal my frame and out it. And so, you know, I mean, if we keep that dialogue open about the skewed or prejudiced or assumptive perspective of the landscape architect with respect to the communities and populations that he or she is dealing with, I think that's all right, as long as we're very clear that, you know, we have this frame and that other frames may be very different. And, you know, so the question is, can these frames coexist? And how do we enable that to happen? And that is a question of design, how we design with peoples whose futures aren't even known to themselves, let alone to us who purport to plan for them. Tricky.
You may have actually already answered the question, but I was curious whether you would be willing to share with us what your motivation for your occupation with this topic initially was, and whether you mentioned at the end the Republic of what was your
Beings.
term? Beings.
Should be becomings.
Different, yeah, becomings.
Yeah.
So, you know, for me, this calls into mind also the question, you know, of the authoritarian planner designer, and whether maybe, you know, lack of democracy or questions like that were part of a motivating factor in your work at all.
Yeah, I think there's a big political dimension, and I think for me, we really need to grasp the nettle of the political issues if we're going to, you know, perform well as designers of the public political space. As far as origins go, you know, like you asked when I started thinking about this or something like that, I remember it very clearly. I was sitting in the lunchroom of the university school where I was working, in a school of architecture, landscape architecture, planning and design. It was 1995, and my colleague who was an architect came in and slapped down the edition of AD, which was called Architecture After Geometry. And he said, "Ha, got there before you." And I thought, well, actually, no, you haven't. And you know, I've got a big discussion about all that. But to me, and I'm really going to sort of lay my prejudices on the line here in a very diverse audience. But yeah, I don't. I mean, I come to it from not being an architect, but I also come from not being a landscape architect, because I never trained as a landscape architect. So I've never had to deal with the kind of parameters that are placed around design training or the reception of it. And so for me, I think that was a really important thing.